answer it, but it's not the question I want to consider today. Because today I'm considering, how do we Sabbath? How do we keep a Sabbath day or any Sabbath day? How do we keep Sabbath time? And how do we keep it holy when we feel like sometimes our lives are spinning out of control and I can't do all the things I have to do in the days I have to work, and now you want me to take some time off? And I think maybe if we think about human beings, haven't we always thought that our time is out of control? Because if we didn't, God really wouldn't be telling us that we are supposed to take a day off and think about God. And I also know, I grew up in farming country, and I know cows have to be milked a couple times a day, and cows don't care if you have a Sabbath. They don't. You'd better do the milking. And ancient agriculturalists had the same dilemma. They had work that just had to be done. They couldn't, we can't, just stop and do nothing. But I don't think the Sabbath was meant to do nothing. God is very clear. Do what pleases us and pleases God. And I said that to a friend of mine, and she said, do you really think God means we're supposed to do those things that give us pleasure? Are you going to talk about sex? And I said, no. But you can think about it. But I think what the Sabbath is supposed to be about is putting aside our petty human desires and connecting with creation and with God in a deliberate, intentional, personal, soul-restoring way. Now, there have been times in my life, I call them my 30s, when I thought I had to know absolutely everything that was going on the minute it was happening. I thought if I didn't answer that email as soon as I got it, I would get fired, or even worse, the world might explode. And now that I have email and texts and Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, every time a little ding goes off, I better do something. And then I got some more apps and more dings, and things started to happen, and I thought, oh my, I just have reached my FOMO, my fear of missing out, anxiety breaking point. Because the more I immersed in my technologies, the busier I made myself, the more I really couldn't think, the more I didn't have space. I didn't have space to think, or breathe, or wonder, or consider the awe of the technology I had, or really the awe of creation I had around me. But having a Sabbath from my technology gave me some space. Having a deliberate Sabbath day gives me time to breathe and to think and to wonder and just revel in the awe that is the world around me. Space gives me time to consider the awe of creation, the space to contemplate grace, the grace I don't deserve, but the grace I have. Space gives me time to commune with myself, look inside, regenerate, reflect, play, and rest. And Sabbath gives me time to take a chance to give myself some inspiration. And I love this word inspiration because in ancient Greek and in Old English, the root of inspiration is the breath of God. If I don't slow down, any random breeze across my cheek can be confused with the breath of God, just as I thought any horrible thought I had was an inspiration. So Sabbath time, I think, is planned, designed, sacred time. Sabbath does not happen by happenstance or serendipity. Now, I like a good serendipitous moment, and I will wander off down the rabbit hole of serendipity at the drop of a chocolate bar. But Sabbath is intentionality that requires planning. Sabbath is about having a ritual that creates a pattern of behavior, an action and reaction, so that you know what to do. And Sabbath is that sense that if I miss one, there's something in your life that you know is missing. Your timing for the rest of the week is a little off, and everything seems to be out of kilter, and the rhythm and the pace of your life just has changed. God gave us this commandment, but what we do is we make the ritual around the command. and how we make the rituals shapes our connection to God and to each other. Now, when Colette and I first met, I was a second-year graduate student with 3 part-time jobs, and she was a mid-career professional. Our lives were crazy busy. But we fell into the pattern that Friday night when we got home from work, we didn't do any work and we didn't do anything that didn't involve the other person. When we made plans, those plans included each other, and without much thought, we carved time out for us. We also attended a Sunday church service at 7 o'clock on Sunday night, so we didn't get home Sundays until 9:30 or 10 o'clock. And that's when we started to plan for the next week, and we would get our schedules out and we would look at times that we would have together, and they may be erratic and we may not really see each other much until the next Friday. And when I had breaks or she had vacations, we took time off and we would plan trips to Ohio Pile or Pymatuming or just go hiking around the neighborhood. But what we would do is plan to intentionally spend time together. And it wasn't so much the idea that what we did, it was that we did it together. We spent time together, and the time together was always planned. It gave me, and I hope her, something to look forward to. It meant I planned time with her, so I thought about her, and then we did our time together, and then we have the memories of the things we did together. But it also meant when we had time together, we weren't giving each other that blank look of, I don't know, what do you want to do? I don't know, what do you want to do? And spend 4 hours not knowing what to do and end up at the movies. And as wonderful as all of those memories are, I mean, we've been together 32 years, so we've had 32 years of a lot of Sabbaths. They are not just the warm glow of courting and relationships. They are also Sabbaths that we created with and for each other. And I think busy people can do this, because part of the ritual of the Sabbath is making the time, carving out the space, and establishing boundaries that says inside this time is for us, and outside of this time is for the world. This us time is for us as partners, as families, as parents, but it's also our us time with God. It is time that is set apart from our daily work world, and it gives us the space to breathe and shape and grow together. So I ask again, how do you Sabbath? And what do we mean by a Sabbath today? Because last week during our getting ready for work week, or year, I heard many people say their lives are so busy they can't unplug. They can't disengage. But I say when you unplug and you disengage, when you tell your students, I'm a college professor, I don't answer emails on Saturday and Sunday. Unless you are donating a kidney, life is really not an emergency. And they say, but, and I'm like, yeah, I'll see you on Monday morning at 9 o'clock when my work week starts. When you disengage and unplug, you consciously shift the focus of the center of your life. The simple act of unplugging, disconnecting, not answering that email allows me to move out of the center of my focus and helps me place God there. It is in this created space that we have our Sabbath. And at first I thought, well, what's going to happen if I don't answer every bell and whistle and alert that comes across my email? And I realized the world went on without me. And I was a little hurt. Like, how dare that world not need me? And how dare those people not need me to make their decisions for them? And then I was amazed. They have the ability to make their own decisions. And then I was relieved. I'm not in charge. God is. Now, I know real emergencies do and continue to happen, but I also don't need to know the moment, as sad as it was, that a player gets traded, or the stock market does something, or the president tweets something shocking. Unplugging occasionally helps me decide what is important, and it helps me to realign my priorities. Now, I've deliberately used ideas of Sabbath time and Sabbath day. And here at St. Brendan's, we have groups that engage in Sabbath time together. Think of Brendan's Boots. They set time aside, they meet together, they have meaningful conversations while they enjoy nature, and they walk with each other. They take pleasure in creation and in turn create with and for each other. We also have sticks and strings, a knitting group, we have reading groups, and we have study groups, all of which engage in time set aside where they meet together, have meaningful conversations, and enjoy each other. And by telling each other their stories, they create Sabbath time together to walk with God. And every Sunday we have Sabbath, a day we set aside to do that which is most pleasurable to God. We come together to worship, pray, and join together to join with Him. And now on most Sundays, I get here at 7:30, and I stay until 1 or 2, and then I go home and I put on my gardening clothes. And for me, this is not labor. It is more time on my knees, but it is my opportunity to remain with God after church for longer, more intimate conversations. Or I fall on the couch and take a nap. It just depends on what happens. And I also think, isn't science great? Because science keeps proving what God gave us from the very beginning. God told us to take a rest. And science has been proving the more we rest, the more effective workers we are. And science keeps trying to prove what God has given us. That study after study reveals the most effective workers are those who regularly take time away from work. And it's not just a day off or a vacation day from work. It is the people who have deliberate, planned time. The people who tell their bodies by the ritual of their work that their minds are stepping back, re-engaging with their humanity, and allowing themselves to have deep, refreshing, rejuvenating Sabbaths. I, of course, looked up TED Talks to find out if this was really happening. And I found a man who works for 6 years at design in New York City, shuts his business down for an entire year. He takes a Sabbath year. And he says, we need to retool. The world is changing. We need to stay with it. But I don't want people who are exhausted. I want inspired people who have a lot of rest. I don't let them work on Sundays, and every 7 years or every 6 years we have an entire year off. And I think, wow, you have a Sabbath. Isn't that amazing? In college, I hear a rumor that in some schools, none of which I ever worked at, they have sabbaticals, which are kind of, it's a Sabbath, right, to re-engage with what we do. So when God commanded us to have a Sabbath day and keep it holy, God was commanding us to get back in touch with our spiritual selves. Now, and I know working 6 days and having a 7th day for Sabbath is a luxury that many of us think we can't afford. And some of us do have to work on 7 days, especially if we can't control our work schedules. And for people who are underemployed or underpaid and work multiple jobs just to keep life and limb together, they look at me and say, how am I supposed to have a Sabbath? And that's what the old rabbis in the Old Testament did, is they said, you must do this. This is a command. I order you to do this. But what if we thought of it this way? What if we thought God said to us, I don't want you to have to work so much. I want you to have a day of rest, and I want you to enjoy what really matters in life. I promise to meet your needs if you just work 6 days a week. Rather than sounding like a command, doesn't that sound like a gift? I want you to have the gift of time. I want you to spend that time doing that thing which pleases me but also pleases you. Spend it with your family. Get to know your friends a little better. Get to know yourself a little better, and spend some time with me. I'm just sitting here at church waiting for you to drop by. Signed, God. And the beautiful thing about Sabbath is that every week it reminds us that God wants us to do 2 things. That the first thing about the Sabbath is that it is that all true blessings come from God's grace, not from our labor. At the end of my life, I don't think I'm going to say, if I had just worked a little harder and taught a couple more classes and maybe dug a couple more ditches, I would have more grace in my life. I do know that the more I go to church, the more grace-filled my life feels. And the other thing is that if we hallow and honor God and keep the holy day that he wants us to keep, if we seek the fulfillment of God in our life, then blessings will come to us because of our special attention to God on his day. Now, in the passage from Isaiah today, he clearly lays out that the Sabbath command is in fact a command to experience joy. Because what he says basically is, if you remove the yoke of labor from yourself and call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of God honorable, the Lord will guide your ways and satisfy your needs, and you will have an abundance. If you call the Sabbath a delight and a holy day of the Lord honorable, and you honor it by not going your own way and serving your own interests or pursuing your own affairs, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and the Lord will make you ride upon the heights of the earth. That sounds pretty great. If you take a day off, you're going to have really great adventures with God. And not only that, it also says in the Psalms that if we keep the Sabbath, if we take rest and find comfort in our time with God, God will satisfy us with all good things, and our youth will be renewed like an eagle's. Now, part of that is really important to me, or very personal to me, because it was from my grandmother's funeral. And she was 100 when she died. And the idea that she was now that youthful young person flying with eagles and not the 100-year-old woman who could barely walk is just joyous to me. So God's purpose for us on the Sabbath is that we experience the highest and most intense joy that we can experience, mainly that we take delight in the Lord. And maybe here in the United States we think, well, I get a lot of days off. I have 6 weeks off every summer, and I've got all this vacation time banked, and I get every weekend off, so I have a lot of leisure. I don't need the Sabbath. And when people tell me that, I say, well, what do you do? And they say, well, I work really hard and I play really hard. And I say, well, what I'm not hearing you say is you rest really hard. You just are playing. And I think what we do, and this is the warning in Isaiah, is we pursue our own pleasures. We busy ourselves to try to get away from our own suffering. And we get away from God, and we really get away from ourselves and our families. And in our busyness, we don't slow down, and we don't enjoy direct interaction with God in any way, and everything becomes an obligation rather than a joy. Oh, I have to go to church. Not, I want to go to church. It's going to be great. I love the kids when they come back and they run up to the altar and they're like, I'm here. God's with me. And I'm like, isn't this great? And this is where I think Jesus and the rabbis have a disagreement. By the time of Jesus, the rabbis had added so many details of the rules of what could and could not be done on the Sabbath that they made the Sabbath a legal obligation and not a gift of the Spirit. So when Jesus comes along, his different tradition of the Sabbath collides with the rabbis, mostly because Jesus came from an agricultural world and the rabbis were living artisanal lives. In each of the Gospels, the story differs slightly, but the essence is always the same. Jesus works on the Sabbath. Jesus goes to the temple, and Jesus teaches. And I find it interesting that in no gospel do they say teaching is work. They always say Jesus teaches and then he does something else, and that's the work. And I'm like, teaching is work, people. But he's always healing, or they harvest, or something happens. And in today's reading, Jesus is in the synagogue and he heals a woman who'd been crippled for 18 years. He sets her free from her affliction, and the leader of the synagogue rebukes Jesus. And again this week, Jesus uses the word hypocrite. Can't you see what is directly in front of your face? This woman, a daughter of Abraham, has been the victim of the devil, and you are in her way. He puts them to shame. And there's another story where Jesus heals the man with a withered hand, and Jesus says, of how much more value is this woman than a sheep? How much more lawful is this healing than what is done on the Sabbath? Doing good on the Sabbath is the right thing to do. So what was wrong with the rabbis? Why couldn't they see the Old Testament the same way Jesus did? Because all of the law is summed up in this sentence: You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The rabbis couldn't see the true meaning of the Sabbath because they didn't have the love of their neighbor in their hearts. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, Jesus says in Mark. So if your heart isn't a heart for man, if it is not a heart of love, you cannot see the true meaning of Sabbath, and you will never truly have a Sabbath. For the Sabbath is a gift of love to meet our needs, not an impressive burden to make our lives miserable. So what Jesus gives us in this reading is a liberation of the Sabbath from a rule-bound duty to one where we are to pursue our pleasures, our joy, and our communion with God. Sabbath is a time for rest, recovery, relaxation, reunion, and restoration. I couldn't think of another R. It is impossible that such a day focused on Jesus should be a burden to a believing heart. Because as Jesus said, come to me all who labor and are heavy come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Amen.